Good evening and welcome, and thank you for joining us for the Oxford Internet Institute's Wednesday webinar, and we're excited to bring you the first instalments of our Next Generation series, The Digital Lives of Black Women in Britain in Times of Crisis, featuring guest speaker Dr. Francesca Sobandi, hosted by Professor Gina Neff of the OII. A little housekeeping. We are fortunate to have a varied audience with a wide range of views, and we request that the opinions of others are respected in this space. For your awareness, this event is being recorded and will be posted on our website following the event. You can pose any question using the Q&A tab at any time, and these will be answered towards the end of the talk. And please try and keep questions as concise as possible. The questions will be visible to all attendees and can be upvoted and commented upon, and we will endeavour to follow up on any unanswered queries. Please allow me to introduce Francesca and Gina.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us this evening. It is my great privilege to welcome Francesca Sobandi to our community tonight. Before I get to introductions, I'd like to talk a little bit about what the Next Gen speaker series is. So this is the Oxford Internet Institute's Next Gen Speaker Series uses our platform to showcase the next generation of Internet studies scholars from around the globe. And these lectures are intended to inform our students, our research community, and our public audiences about new and emerging perspectives on digital technologies and data, with a particular focus on intersectional approaches to the questions of justice, fairness, and equity in an increasingly technologically mediated society. So we are in for a real treat tonight because our first speaker in this series is Dr. Francesca Sobandi. She is a lecturer in digital media studies and director of the BA in journalism and culture at Cardiff University. In addition to having published several peer review articles in top journals since her PhD, she is co-editor with Professor Agugo Emejulu of To Exist is to Resist, Black Feminism in Europe from Pluto Press in 2019. She joins us tonight to talk about her new book from Palgrave Macmillan, The Digital Lives of Black Women in Britain, and what her findings mean for the current COVID-19 crisis. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Sobandi.
Thank you very much for inviting me to deliver this session this evening. And it goes without saying, I'm well aware I'm one of many different people who might be viewed as being part of this next generation of internet scholars and digital media studies researchers, but I really appreciate the opportunity to share my work this evening with everybody who's here, and hopefully in a moment there will be some slides that should be showing for everybody who is attending right now. So I will give that a go, and if technology is doing its thing for us. There we are. So today I'm speaking a lot about research that I have been doing for a number of years, which focuses on the media experiences of Black women in Britain, with an emphasis on Black women's digital media experiences. So what this means is I'm drawing on over 5 years of research and thinking a lot about this current moment, thinking about the different crises that Black women are dealing with. And I just wanted to briefly mention that this is really drawing on my recent book, The Digital Lives of Black Women in Britain, which was published with Palgrave Macmillan last year. And there are 2 open access chapters which deal with questions and issues to do with Black women in the media in Britain, with a focus on the history of Black women's media experiences and the different forms of collective organising that have related to that, as well as an open access chapter on Black women's digital diaspora, collectivity and resistance. There's currently a 20% discount code that is available if you're interested in buying this through Palgrave Macmillan, but I'll also add that the entire book is available open access through the Free Black University, which is a really, really brilliant and important ongoing group project movement, really. And I always say to people, if you're not aware of the brilliant work that the Free Black University is doing, the phenomenal grassroots work that they're doing, then please do read up about them and look into ways that you can try to support all that they are about and all that they are working towards. So that's their online e-library, where there are many different brilliant resources that can be accessed for free. So this research that I am sharing this evening I started my PhD in 2015 with the intention to look into the different ways that Black women in Britain are represented on television and the different TV experiences of Black women in Britain. But when I started to interview Black women about this very issue, what became clear was that many people were actively turning away from mainstream media. They were saying there was a huge gap in terms of meaningful, nuanced depictions of Black women in British television. And because of that, it was oftentimes digital spaces, social media, and digital tools that Black women were making use of to either seek out images, narratives, news stories, or create content themselves. This process also involved me making sort of efforts to really try and draw on creative methods and self-reflexive methodological approaches. So I explored the use of painting, the use of photography, creative writing. I produced a lot of bad poetry as a way to try and stay grounded whilst doing this work and figure out what this work meant in terms of my relationship with the work as a researcher, as somebody who had some similar experiences to those that were being discussed by the Black women that I interviewed, but who could also recognize distinct differences between some of my own experiences and the experiences that other people were discussing. And I'm sure that there are different people who are attending this session right now who might be doing their own research, who might have been doing research for many years, for many decades. There might be students here, there might be independent researchers who are interested to know a bit more about my overall approach to working with different methods and self-reflexive ways to do this sort of work. So if anybody has any additional questions, of course, please do feel free to ask during this session or at a later date. When I was looking at the media experiences and the digital experiences of Black women in Britain from really 2015 to 18 whilst working on my PhD, but beyond that, I was continuing to expand on this work whilst finishing up my book last year, I found that I was thinking about different questions and topics to do with Black cultural transmission and consciousness raising, the digitally mediated nature of Black women's work and labour, and the different forms of knowledge production and knowledge sharing that Black women were very much at the centre of, and how that knowledge sharing and knowledge production is often dismissed, overlooked, and also co-opted by different commercial institutions and academic institutions as well. And throughout this, I was really interested in the notion of Black digital diaspora. So thinking a lot about the phenomenal foundational work of Anna Everett on all of these sorts of issues, and how the digital experiences of Black women in Britain are shaped by tensions between digital cultures, potentially countercultural, communal, and also commercial qualities. I could be here for hours speaking about the different writers, activists, scholars, creatives whose work has played an incredible role in terms of how I'm trying to understand these different elements of Black women's digital media experiences. But I wanted to pause and spend a little bit of time talking through some of the key pieces of writing, some of the key projects, some of the key groups that have really played such a huge part in the way I'm able to do this work and the way I'm able to develop my own approach as a researcher. So Black feminist and Black cyber feminist work has really offered such vital understandings and such vital knowledge surrounding the digital experiences of Black women. So here I'm thinking about the work of scholars such as Catherine Knight-Steele, who I believe has a really exciting forthcoming book on digital Black feminism. Also the work of Kashona Gray. I'm thinking about Black cyber feminism and how that has provided such important language, such important theorizing, such important recognition of the different ways that Black women experience digital environments. And thinking also about critical race and digital studies, how as an expanding area, and particularly when I was at the early stages of my research as a PhD student, it was so heartening and encouraging and enriching to see the work that was emerging within that space. So here, drawing a lot on the work of people such as Andre Brock, thinking about distributed Blackness, thinking about Black cyber cultures, and again, reflecting on all that has and hasn't changed since Anna Everett's Digital Diaspora, A Race for Cyberspace. When I was thinking and looking at the different ways that digital Blackness and digital diaspora has been explored before and has been understood, I was also well aware of the sort of innovative and incredibly oftentimes community-oriented work of different writers, different activists, and different scholars, including thinking about pieces of writing such as the intersectional internet, thinking about Safia Amoja Noble's work on algorithms of oppression, and often turning to the words and research of people such as Moya Bailey, whose conceptualization and articulation of misogynoir has been so transformative in terms of how we see Black women's experiences of online spaces being understood, being referred to, and being articulated in their own words. Also, I could speak at length, but the book #Activism by Sarah J. Jackson, Moya Bailey, and Brooke Foucault-Wells has been phenomenal. And also, of course, so much work by Black women and Black feminists in Britain. So it was really an incredible moment to see the republication of Heart of the Race, Black Women's Lives in Britain by Beverly Bryan, Stella Dadsey, and Susan Scaife. And to just see how Black feminists have been organising throughout history, which I'll speak a bit more about shortly, in Britain, to really challenge the different ways that Black women have been depicted or excluded from media for so many reasons to do with intersecting oppressions that we know are still very much here and are still very much struggled against by Black women right now. So this is to all really say that the Centre for Critical Race and Digital Studies has this wonderful syllabus, which is, a really great resource for anybody who wants to know more about this sort of scholarship. Another text that I return to time and time again is the work of Ruth Benjamin, particularly all of the analysis and research around race after technology. And I'll be speaking shortly about how Benjamin's work in relation to understandings of citizenship and the relationship between digital consumerism and citizenship has really helped me to think through how Black women in Britain are experiencing the internet and different digital technologies as part of their daily lives. I know in 2019, there was this wonderful conference, the 2019 Center for Critical Race and Digital Studies conference at NYU in Washington, DC. And I was sort of, I think, coming maybe towards the end of my PhD process then, or I don't know, I would have had my Viva not too long before that, actually, in 2018. And to have the opportunity to learn from so many incredible researchers, writers, and scholars at that event, again, has played a really pivotal role in how I've tried to develop my research. And all the time also think about differences and similarities between how issues to do with race, to do with Blackness, to do with Black women's lives manifest in the context of the US and in Britain. Something else I just wanted to mention before I start to grapple with my own work is the Race in the Marketplace Research Network. So I'm communications co-chair of the Race in the Marketplace Research Network with Dr. Naya Jones. And this is a community of scholars, practitioners, artists, activists who do work that deals with different issues to do with racism and the marketplace broadly defined. So again, I think when I'm doing talks like this, I'm oftentimes reflecting on the different people who have supported me over the years, who have helped me to do this work. And there are so many people at this first Race in the Marketplace Research Network event in 2017, who I'm incredibly grateful for in terms of their unwavering encouragement and how they've helped me to hopefully develop some critical analysis skills and stay open to always learning and to do things in different ways and learning about not only what has come before, but what is coming up in terms of the next generation of scholarship, including from individuals who are doing this work outside of academic institutions. So from the thesis to the book, very briefly to let you know a bit about how I have gone about developing my work since working as a PhD student, I found that whilst working towards this book, there was less of a focus on the content of representations and more of a focus on the politics and power dynamics impacting Black women's experiences of work, labour, and digital technology in spaces. So this involved trying to account more for the history or account for more of the history of Black women's experiences of media and activism in Britain. And I also had the opportunity, after I finished up my PhD in 2018, to spend more time analysing archive material. So the Spare Rib Digital Archive was so, incredibly helpful in terms of allowing me to learn more about what Black women were doing in the 80s, what Black women were doing in terms of collectively organising to challenge forms of structural oppression, to do with racial capitalism, to do with anti-Blackness, to do with sexism and misogyny. And as far as I'm aware, when I last checked, unfortunately, I don't think the digital archive is still up and running as it was, because that was a project that in some way or another, I think, related to funds to do with Britain being in the EU. So it's just to say that archive was such a rich resource, and I think there are still different ways that you can look at archival material to do with spare rib, but I really appreciate the fact that it existed as it did when I was doing this research. And also the Black Cultural Archives, BCA, is just such an often under-acknowledged archive in Britain, and one that really focuses on the lives and history of Black people in ways that few archives and few institutions in Britain do. So where is this work located? So as is probably very clear by now, my work is dealing with the lives of Black women in Britain, and this involves for me recognition of differences between Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland and England, so Britain's constitutive nations, and thinking about various regions within them as well. So here I'm reflecting on the work of Leah Basil and Akugo Imejulu in terms of thinking about austerity and thinking about the different ways, as they have highlighted, Black women and women of colour are dealing with austerity in their research in relation to Britain and France. And here I really want to highlight their work also because it does a phenomenal job in terms of illustrating how the different experiences of Black women aren't only shaped by national contexts, but by regional ones as well. So recognising the differences between what's going on in Scotland in comparison to England, how notions of multiculturalism in these different spaces can result in slightly different environments for Black women in these places. But whilst I was doing this work, I was really conscious of differences between the notion of being British and being in Britain. So I was trying to avoid negating the experiences of Black women in Britain who primarily identify with a sense of nationhood located outside of Britain. And I also didn't want to dismiss the experiences of Black women who don't identify with any notion of nationhood or citizenship at all. So I'm aware that Black women's experiences of identity, nationality, migration, asylum seeking can drastically vary. And I was also reflecting on Ruth Benjamin's work, whereby there's this discussion of transactional notions of citizenship, when there's an emphasis on individuals, I think as Benjamin puts it, browsing, clicking, buying, spending time in digital consumerist settings. So for me, when I was doing this work, and as I continue to do work that focuses on the lives of Black people in Britain, I'm thinking about the national and regional parameters of different locations that Black people are navigating. And one of the women who I interviewed really emphasised what it meant to be a Black woman in a rural part of Britain, and what it meant to live somewhere with generated electricity, which means that the electricity goes off. There have been no neighbours, so it's fairly remote. And my mother's mother would make video recordings from films that were on television. So I often share these words because I think it really highlights the fact that Black women's digital experiences or lack of digital experiences can vary considerably. Sometimes there's this implication that all Black women experience the internet or digital spaces in the same way, or that all Black women in Britain have access to computers, to mobile devices, to Wi-Fi, to strong internet connections. And that's just not true. So here I'm now thinking about the work of independent researcher, collective organizer and activist Layla Roxanne Hill, who has written about media in relation to Scotland and how representation of local news from smaller regions, oftentimes we find that local news in smaller regions is very much dismissed, it's overlooked, there's a lack of funding, doesn't necessarily even make it into new independent media. And this comment is also applicable to other parts of Britain, where there tends to be much more of an emphasis and much more of a sort of monetary investment really in what's going on in large cities, much more of a societal focus on capital cities, for example, what's happening in London, perhaps at times what's happening in Cardiff. And within all of this, there's also something to be said about how the regionally distinct Black experiences or the regionally distinct experiences of Black people are rarely meaningfully acknowledged amid mainstream media and politics in Britain, and sometimes scholarship too. So this is, again, for me, why it is helpful to think about the experiences of Black women in Britain, as opposed to using this term British. And when we know that there are Black people in Britain who might identify as Welsh, Northern Irish, Scottish, English, or might not, again, identify with any notion of nationality, nation state, or nation at all. So now I'm going to spend a bit of time getting into, or going into more detail, thinking about how Black feminism relates to all of this. So Black feminism in the media involves, or a Black feminist approach to looking at the media in Britain, involves looking at how Black women have attempted to address the material conditions, racial capitalism, and intersecting oppressions that they face, and including how media processes, narratives, and depictions are implicated in this. So this is always about more than just the politics of representation, but of course the politics of representation is at play here too. And what I mean by that, I'm thinking of the work of Kristen Warner on plastic representation and the difference between just focusing on what changes at a surface level, the difference between focusing on the number of Black people who appear on screen, and considering what are the labor and production processes behind the scenes. What are the material conditions that Black women are having to deal with? How are they treated as part of this process? Who's leading this project? Are there any political underpinnings? If so, what are they? And the work of Carol Boyce Davis, when focusing on the political life of Black communist Claudia Jones, has also been really, really important in terms of going back to and revisiting and rereading when thinking about what has and hasn't changed over the decades in the British media landscape. So in the words of Boyce Davies, today as corporate journalism, embedded reporters, and mass media control via television have become the dominant modes of communication, the absence of more radical media is noticeable. And there's a question around to what extent have changes in terms of digital technology and social media enabled or constrained the potential for more radical or alternative media that is developed by Black women with Black women's interests at heart. So all of this oftentimes involves me thinking about tensions between community, creativity, and commodification. And some of the different things that came through from the interviews that I did included people's concerns with the ways that public discussions that Black women are having on social media may be used and mined by non-Black individuals and institutions in search of material for article pitches or content that connects to Black cultural references, but without involving or crediting Black people, especially Black women. And of course, all of this is shaped by not only, as Moya Bailey and Trudy have highlighted, the intersecting nature of misogyny, sexism, anti-Blackness, heteronormativity, and also thinking about colorism, thinking about transphobia, thinking about classism, thinking about all the different ways that the experiences of Black women are impacted by these structural oppressive forces, which mean that sometimes one Black woman may be involved in harmful processes and practices that really involve the oppression of another Black woman. And also here, just recognizing that we can't assume the politics of all Black women. So sometimes discussions to do with media, to do with politics in the UK will involve this implication that all Black women share this one homogenous political consciousness, when again, we know that's not the case. We know that not everything a Black woman does and says online is rooted in a Black feminist position or is rooted in a resistant political position either. And the work of Aziza Johnson, who does a lot of writing, a lot of research, and a lot of community-oriented work that focuses on Black women, focuses on Black geographies, and focuses in particular on Black Muslim women. The work of Johnson includes this brilliant piece refuting how the other half lives, I Am a Woman's Rights, and it also includes a nod to the work of Black women radicals. And this piece, this quote from this piece, I think is really helpful when thinking about how the knowledge production, the theorizing, the knowledge sharing that Black women might be involved in or leading online can oftentimes come at the expense of their health and well-being, and can involve people exploitatively or with a sense of entitlement and sort of asking to be taught, asking to be educated. Last year, when we saw rising discussions of the notion of anti-racism, anti-racist reading lists, and the galvanizing nature of Black Lives Matter organizing and Black liberationist work, there were so many moments where I saw individuals sort of turning to or calling out to sort of any Black woman online, saying sort of, share how I should be doing this differently. So I'm thinking of the words of Johnson here, who says, when Black feminists are asked to bear the brunt of the labour for the purposes of educating those who reproduce normative whiteness, I have to ask, who is actually being centred here? So all of this work has, in different ways, come back to this notion of Black digital diaspora or Black digital diasporic experiences. So thinking about digital Blackness, thinking about the notion and the reality of different types of borders, including borders within online or virtual or digital contexts, and also how international or national or diasporic politics is at play, is operating in relation to how Black women in Britain experience various online settings. So I'm interested in Black digital dialogue between Black people in Britain and the US, and doing this work has involved spending time trying to conceptualize the borders of experiences of Black identity as well. So thinking about the different ways that Blackness is defined or undefined or is contested, in the US, in Britain, who is or isn't regarded as Black and at what moment in time, and thinking about what constitutes a border, how borders and perceptions of them impact issues to do with Black lives in cyberspace and their surrounding political landscapes. So for me at this moment anyway, because I'll also add ideas are always sort of in flux, they can change. Certainly at the point that I've submitted this book, there are other things I'm thinking about in slightly different ways. But right now, the digital experiences of Black people are far from being borderless. They are shaped by physical and virtual geographies and many layers of power and politics, which means that this idea that someone can simply transcend borders by going online and speaking to people in different countries and continents. For me, there's a lot more going on there. It's never as simple as sort of seeing individuals as somehow overcoming perceived borders and boundaries. I've already spoken a little bit about challenging the notion of assumed politics here, and I just want to say that while digital spaces can still be a vital source of collective building, the potential for social media to contribute to a sense of solidarity and community is sometimes fetishized in ways that evade recognition of the difficulties that can be involved in collective building, and the importance of many physical spaces in the collective organizing and lives of Black women. So I think sometimes there's this idea that just because something isn't visible online or just because it wasn't tweeted, it's not happening. When we know that the liberationist, the grassroots, the activist and community-oriented work of Black women in Britain takes many different forms. It's often not visible in the sorts of digital spaces or across the online content sharing platforms that might be at the foreground of conversations to do with Black women's digital lives. So now to move on to speaking about crises. So, there are so many different crises that people around the world are dealing with at any given moment. The COVID-19 pandemic, of course, including the impact of ongoing medical racism, and Moya Bailey's work on misogynoir in medical media here. I really encourage people to read that if they haven't already. And I think that Bailey has forthcoming work on misogynoir in medicine as well. So just building on this extensive amount of research and writing, which really addresses the specific ways that Black women experience various medical institutions and the sort of media coverage that can surround that. So oftentimes last year or since about last March, I've had conversations with different people who refer to different crises. And sometimes the way that British media covers what's going on right now, you'd think that there is just the one crisis that is occurring. And unfortunately, there are so many that we could speak about, including the intersecting forms of oppression that Black women have been dealing with long before COVID-19, and how racial capitalism is part of all of this as well. And the different ways that I've seen brands and commercial institutions respond to various crises, including the pandemic, and including how they've responded to conversations to do with anti-Blackness and police brutality last year, sometimes involves, well, sometimes is a generous way to put it, oftentimes involves these empty statements, these superficial gestures, these cynical moves to protect their public image, their reputation. And we've heard this term, we're all in this together, thrown around quite often. But, who is this we? This implication that everybody is experiencing the pandemic or different crises in the same way is completely inaccurate. So there have been examples of commodified notions of connection, care, and community in brand responses to COVID-19. including when looking at how brands monitor Black women's digital activities and might attempt to replicate them in ways intended to frame the brand as woke. And I'm using the word woke here, emptied of meaning. This is the way we have seen institutions completely erase the origins of this work in terms of African-American history, in terms of the lives of Black people in America, and how brands have been using the term woke to suggest something very different, a very commercialized, commodified notion of social justice activism, which essentially is as far removed from activism as we can imagine. So brands' misuse of commercialized notions of feminism, equality, Black social justice activism, and liberationist organizing as part of marketing that reframes such politics. It's not just brands that are involved in this. There are many academic institutions, some of which we could say operate as brands, that have tried to sort of pivot to being anti-racist overnight. And I just want to highlight this other brilliant piece by Johnson, Throwing Our Bodies Against the White Background of Academia, which gets at some really, really related issues, including what it can mean to be in a conference space or an academic space where there are more Black people in the marketing material than there are in that setting. And also more specifically, how are the Black people in that space treated? How are they treated beyond the context of that one event? I now just want to sort of come towards the end of me speaking about this. There's enough time for us to have some discussion and to respond to some questions. And I just wanted to reflect on Black women's digital hypervisibility. So in the last chapter of my book, which I was finishing up writing last spring, in the midst of the COVID pandemic, I was thinking about institutions that are instructing Black women to go online in order to, I'll go back there, in order to access crucial information that they require, or to communicate with organizations and carry out tasks that are often in the interest of institutions, but actually can hinder the safety, privacy, health, and well-being of Black women. So we've seen increased pressure to participate and present yourself. And I would argue, especially for Black women in digital spaces, where they may be harmed, they may face dangers and forms of abuse that very few institutions seem to care to even try to respond to and to manage. So there's a huge amount of organizational demand on Black women's digital hypervisibility and a real failure or often refusal, really, to provide support that accounts for the forms of harm, danger, and violence that can be involved in this. So now I'm thinking about the work of Beverly Bryan, Stella Dadsey, and Suzanne Scaife. And in Heart of the Race, Black women's lives in Britain, they're speaking about the Black women's experience of work in Britain as mirroring the experience of work over the past 5 centuries. This has been one long tradition of backbreaking labour in the service of European capitalism. And I want to spend some time thinking about this, and I have spent some time thinking about this in relation to digital media, digital technology, surveillance. So commercial institutions' pursuit of profit, productivity, and so-called diverse and anti-racist brand images can involve them spectacularizing Black women and attempting to make Black women use different digital technologies and platforms that enable surveillance and harm. Maybe a question for everybody here is, to what extent have we seen institutions try to respond to this, or to what extent do institutions seem to meaningfully acknowledge the forms of online abuse and violence that Black women face? And also, again, how that is shaped by the intersecting nature of colorism, transphobia, ableism, homophobia, classism, and many different types of oppression. So just to sort of wrap up here and to say, thank you for sort of taking the time to engage with this today. I've been thinking more about branded digital representations or representations of Black people. And as I said earlier on, there are many different writers, creatives, activists, and scholars whose work has shaped my approach to research and continues to shape it. And also another brilliant forthcoming book is, I think, Meredith Clark's work on Black Twitter, which is just so huge and critical in terms of what it has done in terms of expanding the field of Black digital studies and enabling people such as me to do the work that I'm doing today. So some of what I've been looking at in recent weeks, recent months, has involved thinking about digital racism, how it relates to online representations of Black people and associated racist marketplace logics, racist digital practices, and remediations of Blackness in the service of brands. So something that's been interesting to look at is this rise of computer-generated, CGI, racialized, and specifically sometimes Black online influencers. And the work of Lauren and Michelle Jackson has really sort of explored this in incredible detail. That first point when we really started to see the rise of these racialized online influencers, especially CGI influencers that are framed as being Black women. And all of this relates to the spectacularization of Black people, Black lives, and different digital marketing approaches, including digital blackface. So this is from a recent piece of mine on spectacularized and branded digital representations of Black people and Blackness in television and new media, and that's an open access journal article. Thank you very much for your time. I really appreciate you engaging with what I have to share today. And I'm looking forward to having a bit of discussion and following on from this presentation. So thanks again.
Thank you for that. That was a great talk. And you've certainly raised a lot of really interesting questions. I would love for us to start on this work on hypervisibility. In part because you dedicate quite a bit of time in the book on Black women's hypervisibility in digital media, but also in how various crises that everyone, and Black women in particular, are navigating at the moment require a kind of visibility online when their organizations can't provide that protection. What do you hope that organizations could learn to do?
There are probably so many different things, but to maybe try and identify a few simple ones is to first of all not be difficult when Black women refuse to make themselves visible in some of the ways that organizations ask of them or demand of them. So I think oftentimes we can see a big difference between when a Black woman says no to an organization as opposed to when a non-Black person does. And I think that sense of sort of oftentimes punishment or disciplining that organizations will then go on to do in response to a Black woman refusing to make herself visible in a digital space can be incredibly violent. So I know when I look at this last year or so, I feel as though there was maybe a brief window period when institutions were pretending to be sort of empathetic or sympathetic or saying it's not business as usual. And we've seen this overnight, that if anything, I almost feel like things have gotten worse than they were before last March or before the COVID-19 pandemic. And oftentimes organizations are confused, offended, angry that Black women don't want to put their mental health, their physical well-being, their lives at risk to enable organizations in different ways. How can organizations try to support Black women who do that work? I would say asking what they need, and also not only providing that, but thinking, how can they be doing more? How can they ensure that they are listening to Black women and not telling them, this is what we want you to do, and we'll only do it in this way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's really good. That I think you've got something really important to say about the distinction of how we think about the roles and responsibility of the organization of harms. That in online space, individuals, and particularly individuals who are already bearing quite a big burden, are asked to take on more personal responsibility, whereas organizations and companies that might be able to bear different kinds aren't. And so that distinction, I think, in what you call what has been called, and you use, the economy of visibility is really important. One of the things I was struck about in your book is the call for moving beyond representation, as many critical scholars have done, to really think about the politics of media representation and who produces those representations. And I was thinking that this particular moment, we've had such a powerful year that we're all living in these screens. And I thought that having you reflect for a moment about Black women's role in the political economy of the circulation of those images, particularly vis-a-vis what's happened over 2020 and 2021, would be useful. So I wonder if you might be able to speak a bit to that political economy of representation.
Yeah, I think it's, this is maybe me reiterating some of what I was saying earlier on, but particularly around about last summer. And here I'm focusing on Britain, but I'm well aware of similarities elsewhere, and also how what was happening in the US was really the catalyst for anything we saw happening in Britain at that time. But I think when people or institutions were saying they wanted to do more to try to address anti-blackness or to address structural racism, there were huge work and labour demands that were coming the way of Black women. And there were also moments where, again, overnight, institutions had new images, sort of the stock images. There were several Black women who featured, or organizations were posturing, trying to place themselves in proximity to Black women in ways that really made it clear that this was much more a response to their concerns about their image, their concerns in terms of sort of consumerist demand, than it was any meaningful investment in addressing white supremacy or even naming it. So I think when we speak about representation, and when we speak about Black women's representation and thinking about Britain and thinking about digital spaces, one of my worries is just how many examples there are of organizations trying to spectacularize Black women, or demanding a huge amount of work and very rarely crediting them, supporting them in meaningful and sustainable ways, and treating Black women as a means to a commercial end more than anything else.
This is a great way to segue to one of our questions from the audience. So one attendee, who remains anonymous, raises a really interesting point. What's the role of digital platforms? How could digital platforms support and promote the voices of Black women without putting excessive risk and emotional burden on them?
So in a way, I'm not sure to what extent I have faith in digital platforms as we know it, or more specifically, who tends to be behind the creation of them. Actually, one of the things that sort of came out from doing this work, especially from sort of 2018 onwards, was there were people I spoke to 2015, 2016 who were engaging in different digital spaces, who were using digital platforms for different reasons, who now are absolutely off them and have said disengagement and sort of a reclamation of sense of privacy away from digital environments has been so important to them in their lives. So my response to that would be, of course, their digital platforms, they can and should be better. But for me, I don't think I would even use the term solution, any sort of meaningful response to what we're speaking about right now, it definitely can't be led by digital platforms for me. That doesn't mean that I'm dismissive of the importance of digital platforms in terms of the lives of Black women, whether it's as a source of joy, as a way to connect and stay connected to friends, family, partners, as part of work and life. But I feel as though, especially right now, this real emphasis on always being online, this emphasis on being digitally visible, digital presence, digital traces, footprints, whatever we call it, I really struggle to see how that can ever be in the interests of most Black women.
That's a good point. We have a question from Temi Lasande Anderson, who asks, do you have thoughts or reading recommendations on the digital lives of Black women in the global South in comparison to the global North? And particularly as the research has revealed, the notion of race, the notion of Blackness within the African context is different, i.e. not identified as Black, but as Nigerian or Kenyan.
Yeah, thanks for that. So the first thing I'd say is I'm definitely not an expert in this area, but there are lots of brilliant researchers, writers, and scholars out there. And just to sort of pick up on thinking about African feminist media, there is brilliant work, and that again also is looking at the lack of discussions to do with Blackness beyond North America, Blackness beyond a European context. And yeah, I just say that the last thing I would want to do is, in response to that, suggest scholarship by individuals in these places who are writing about what's going on there. But I would say, journals that focus on African feminist media studies and thinking about some of the work in feminist media studies too is really important. I think if I'm able to drop stuff in the Q&A, in fact, there are a few things that come to mind, so I'll drop that in the Q&A box and hope that it will show up to everybody if that works.
I am looking for our next question. We have a question from Emmy Hine. On this point of spectacularizing Black women, how can we move users and platforms beyond the like retweet collectivism that perhaps amplifies Black voices, but doesn't lead to more significant change?
So that was, sorry, could you repeat that question?
Of course. So how do we move beyond like retweet collectivism that perhaps that may be amplifying Black voices, but does not lead to more significant political, I assume political change.
Sure.
Does not more political change.
So I'd say the work of Moya Bailey, Sarah J. Jackson, and Brooke Fuqua-Wells and hashtag activism is really helpful here, because I think, you know, sometimes there can be this myth that what people do and say online doesn't constitute meaningful forms of activism, and I definitely dismiss that notion. But I also recognize that there are times when what is happening online is sometimes mistaken for being reflective of something larger, or a grassroots movement that exists in a different way. So I guess what I'm saying is I don't want to ignore what people are liking, sharing, creating, and posting, but it's about grounding that in what's happening socially and politically offline, and seeing, you know, is what's visible on Twitter reflective of what is happening in other spaces? Is it just a few voices who have gone viral, or are these voices who are part of a much bigger movement?
Mm-hmm.
And I also just wanted to take the opportunity to say as well, one of the key articles I was thinking of in response to that last question is Decolonising African Media Studies in Howard Journal of Communications, by Wimpini Mohammed.
Thank you. Nothing like being put on the spot by eager graduate students who are like, what should I read? And you think you're thinking and you're trying to think and recommend at the same time.
It's a great question. And I'd also say there are many other brilliant pieces by that scholar, including a fantastic piece on specifically focusing on activism and these sorts of things that we're speaking about in relation to digital media. So I can check the title of that before the end of the session too.
And just so we say it aloud, there will be a follow-up email with links and recommendations, and the link and code to the digital lives of Black women in Britain. If you're interested in buying a copy, there's a 20% discount code that's available for you for joining tonight's session. We have a question from Jake Stein, and it's a long question, and in the interest of time in our last 10 minutes, I'll shorten it if I may, Jake. What role do we have for labor unions? So can you imagine a role labor unions will play in addressing the inequalities in both the conditions of technological production as well as the platforms they produce? How could unions avoid asking Black women to bear all the work and consequences of organizing and educating?
So, I mean, I think it depends what union we're dealing with. So I think that sometimes, especially thinking about the British context, some union organising can very much involve a focus on issues to do with class and capitalism, and Marxism, without attending to anti-blackness or Black Marxism, and certainly issues to do with sexism and misogyny. So that's not to say that I don't think unions are important, and I don't think that unions can play a really crucial role in these sorts of issues. So whether that's thinking about unions such as the National Union of Journalists, and different examples of unions that are very much led by Black women, I think it's just the question for me is, who is involved in that work, who's leading it, and to what extent are the experiences of Black women treated as much more than a side note, which unfortunately is often the case.
Mm-hmm. Albie Nanny asks, there's a common notion that that one's online identity can differ from someone's identity offline, right? That we have this notion of either pseudonymity or anonymity. How does this potentially impact the ability for Black communities to engage with each other and with other communities in digital space?
So I think this response is maybe more just about sort of online anonymity and identity in general, but I think everybody approaches being online in different ways. for me, always remembering that unless you really know that person, what you see or what is visible or what is shown is not necessarily reflective of what is going on behind that account. So what I would add, though, is I'm not somebody who thinks we should scrap online anonymity, and I'm not somebody who thinks that online anonymity is the only reason why online abuse and online harms exist. Many people post things very publicly as part of accounts that are identifiable. But I think when maybe reflecting on Black women's experiences here, it's about remembering that, you know, for many Black women, the ability to try and create some sense of anonymity can actually be the only way that they're able to participate in different digital spaces, and that some of the issues that Black women, you know, deal with, well, many of the issues that Black women deal with offline, they don't disappear online, and they might take shape in a slightly different way. So I don't know if that is an answer to that question, but I think what I'm getting at is it's remembering that identity is fluid online and offline, and visibility, the ability to see how somebody presents themselves online, is not necessarily the same as knowing them, you know, and what that then means in terms of how people navigate these different spaces.
We have a question from our doctoral student, Rutendo Chapawika. You've spoken about how Black women are sometimes expected to perform certain labor in digital spaces. In your work, did you come across ways that Black women are resisting or reframing those demands and expectations on their labor?
I think some of the biggest ways are refusing and, you know, coming off of platforms, saying no, sharing work or creating work in very different ways that doesn't involve centering visibility, and trying to make use of digital technology as part of slightly more private experiences, whilst knowing that privacy can never be guaranteed when we're dealing with these sorts of platforms. But I think the biggest way is disengagement and divesting from these spaces, and knowing that a lot of what might be the perceived benefits of them, you know, the sense of community or connection to other people, can sometimes be created in a slightly different way, or with the use of different digital technologies, and much less of an emphasis on visibility. I also just wanted to mention that other article that I was thinking about, it's online activism, centering marginalized voices in activist work. And I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing the author's name exactly right, but Wimpini Fatimata Mohammed.
Great. I just have to say, looking at the Q&A questions, we've gotten so many positive responses, and so many people who have said this is a great talk, and they're really grateful. So on behalf of everybody who's asked questions and who has attended, I want to thank you. I would love to hear where your work goes next. What's your next project?
So one of the main projects I'm working on focuses on the lives of Black people in Scotland. So that's in collaboration with independent researcher and writer and activist Leila Roxanne Hill. And we've really been doing this work for a good number of years now. But we're working on bringing that together as part of a book and focusing on Black lives in Scotland. And that should be out with Bloomsbury and Z Books in 2022. And alongside that, I'm doing different projects that focus on questions to do really with identity, inequality, ideology, and different digital spaces. So I'm also doing a project with Dr. Anamik Saha at Goldsmiths University and Professor David Hesmanhal, which looks at the different ways that creative and cultural workers who have to deal with and encounter and sort of respond to racism as part of their daily lives, make use of digital media and digital technology as part of their creative and cultural practices, and sometimes as part of how they try to challenge the racism that they're attempting to survive.
We probably have time for one or two more questions. Alexander Lean asks a tough question, I think, on how the messages and programs of Black feminists might be trivialized when spread on social media and in digital space by non-Black people. For example, the social media blackout during the Black Lives Matter protest. How do you think that's best solved? How do allies authentically amplify? I'm going to recast this from Alexander Lean, if I may. How can allies authentically amplify the voices of Black feminists?
I think we could have a longer conversation about the notion of allyship and sometimes the limitations of how it's understood in public discourse. But I think reflecting on who or what is being amplified and what the result of that will be in terms of the work or the person who is being made more visible, the hypervisibility surrounding it. And also thinking about the different ways that, if it's to do with information sharing or raising awareness about stuff, how that can be done oftentimes, offline or as part of one-to-one direct communication, as part of private messages. I also want to just mention the brilliant work of Keisha Bruce at University of Nottingham and Rihanna Walcott at King's College London, who are both doing really, really important Black feminist digital studies research projects as part of their PhDs, which involves really focusing on some of these questions to do with, private spaces and public spaces, and also, meme culture, digital remix culture, and who or what is amplified and what impact that has on those people.
We are very getting very close to the end of time, but we have one anonymous question that I'm sure we can't answer in 1 minute, but we'll try. What responsibility do you think social media platforms have to committing to understand differences in how language is used across different communities and adjusting their content moderation algorithms accordingly? And this was specifically in response to censoring content from Black Lives Matter activists.
It's tricky because, in a way, when thinking about surveillance, I'm not sure how much I want different social media organizations to be, incredibly well versed in the different ways that different people, different communities are speaking, their specific use of words, language, vernacular. But what I would just say is that social media companies always need to be doing more. I don't know how much faith we can have in them. But I don't think that doesn't mean there shouldn't be that demand for changes to take place. And there are so many other Black women who've been doing this work for a lot longer than me, and particularly Black women who are activists, who aren't institutionally affiliated, who aren't resourced and funded by various institutions, who have been calling this out for the longest of times, but we've still seen very little change.
I think working towards that change is probably a good way to end for this evening. Thank you so much for joining us. We will have a brief announcement, I think, from our events assistant on our next events. Thank all of you for joining us.
And thanks again to everybody for inviting me today.
Thank you, both of you, Francesca and Gina, for a fascinating insight today. It was really interesting and a really nice way to end a day. So thank you so much. And thank you, everyone, for attending. And you'll receive a follow-up email in due course. We'll link all of the information and all the things that Francesca referred to in her talk in that email. So do look for it. And the second installment of the Next Generation series will be happening later this month. So again, with Dr. Matthew Buie. So look out for our emails and look out for our website announcements so you can see and sign up for that one as well. And we're hosting our next event, the Reconfigure event, tomorrow, which is Feminist Action Research in Cybersecurity. And that's a report launch that's happening. So again, look on our website to sign up. Our next Wednesday webinar series is with Tristan Harris on the 10th of February at 6 p.m. That's UK time. So please visit the events page on our website to sign up. Thank you again, everyone. Have a wonderful day, morning, evening, wherever you are in the world. And thank you very much for attending.